This is a song I wrote a year or so ago after a particularly hard evening, and the next morning standing down by our lake and seeing the morning star and then the coming dawn reminded me that things always get better when the sun comes up. And I reckon in the coming weeks, if Mr. Trump and Mr. Barr's plan to restart the killing machine in Terre Haute comes to fruition, that we're going to have some hard nights, but we'll also have some beautiful mornings. And this reminds us to make today count and make the tomorrow better. It's called Long Night of Sorrow. It's been a long, long night of sorrow. It's been a long, long night of sorrow. It's been a long, long night of sorrow. And my heart is on the ground. I believe that the dawn's a-coming. Yes, I believe that the dawn's a-coming. No, I believe that dawn's a-coming, for this earth keeps turning round. I see that morning star arising. Lord, I see that morning star arising. I can see that morning star arising, and my heart is heaven bound. You know, today becomes tomorrow. I know today it becomes tomorrow. Yes, today it becomes tomorrow. Ain't no sorrow gonna hold me down. I know today it becomes tomorrow. Ain't no sorrow gonna hold me down. Let's keep working for those tomorrows, and let's fight for justice in America. Blessed be. Good morning to all those gathered in the sanctuary at UU Church in Terre Haute. I'm speaking to you from my cabin in Owen County. I would rather be there with you. It's much more fun to talk to you in person and to hear your laughter, to see your face, and preaching is a two-way street, and I miss it. But since I'm 70 years old and have what is called RAD, it's reactionary airway disease, a respiratory problem, chronic, I decided it's better for me to stay away from people as much as possible for a while. Hopefully it won't be too long. I encourage you to follow CDC guidelines rather than the words of Mr. Trump and Mr. Pence and his wife. Be safe and let us be wise in these times. My sermon today is entitled The Killing Field, Executions in Our Backyard. William Stringfellow wrote, "Engagement in specific and incessant struggle against death's rule renders us human. In resistance, persons live most humanly. No to death means yes to life." End quote. As I'm sure most of you are aware, the Trump administration has restarted the machinery of death at the Federal Penitentiary in the field off Highway 63. As the writer of Ecclesiastes stated, "There is nothing new under the sun." Crucifixion was a common practice in the Roman Empire, along with feeding miscreants, many of them Christians, to the lions. A few centuries ago, burning at the stake was a method of choice of the Christians. who by then thought themselves to be absolutely right in the eyes of God. Michael Servetus was burned at the stake in the name of God with what was supposed to be the last copy of his book on the errors of the Trinity strapped to his leg. They didn't have video cameras, but such events were public occasions, and they were meant to strike terror in the hearts of the infidels. By the way, if you have not read Out of the Flames by Lawrence and Nancy Goldstone, I highly recommend it. It's a page-turner of a history book about Servetus, the father of modern Unitarianism, and his book, which was at one time the rarest book on the planet. Theologian Walter Wink wrote, and I quote, "The belief that violence saves is so successful because it doesn't seem to be mythic in the least. Violence simply appears to be the nature of things. It's what works. It seems inevitable, the last and often the first resort in conflicts. If a God is what you turn to when all else fails, violence is certainly a God. What people overlook then is the religious character of violence. It demands from its devotees an absolute obedience unto death." End quote. The absurdity of redemptive violence lies at the very heart of Orthodox Christianity. The idea that we are saved by the execution of Jesus of Nazareth gives redemptive violence credibility. And so in our time, in this very year, a president and an attorney general, both claiming to be Christians, decide to provide red meat to their wrong-wing Christian base by killing in the name of justice. In the mid-1990s, my wife Glenda and I were asked by the UU Church of Bloomington to attend the first gathering of religious leaders for the abolition of the death penalty, called by Sister Helen Prejean, author of Dead Man Walking. At that meeting in Washington, D.C., I committed to preaching an abolition sermon at least once a year, and I did so here at Terre Haute for several years. Some folks think that preaching to UUs about the death penalty is more like preaching to the choir. I found that not to be the case. The first time I preached an abolition sermon at the Bloomington UU Church after that conference, back in the late 90s, a man met me at the back of the church. As is custom, people file out and tell the minister whether it was good or bad or other things. And one man came up to me and said, "So, do you think that people who kill children, men who kill children, have a right to live?" And I said, "I don't argue whether or not they have a right to live. I simply say that I have no right to kill." He looked me square in the eyes and yelled in a loud voice, which was heard by all, "You can go straight to hell." I kind of smiled and said, "You know, that's not much of a threat. The Universalists don't have a hell." And we remind people who hear this sermon or visitors to UU churches that you don't have to agree with the minister, because we simply don't have a hell to send you to. Indiana has the unique dishonor of being the only state with 2 death rows. Our state house of homicide is in Michigan City, and the last time it was used was in the execution of Eric Wrinkles in 2009. Our second house of homicide, as you surely know, is here in Terre Haute, just a few miles from our UU church. The last federal execution was the killing of Lewis Jones, a Gulf War veteran accused of killing another soldier. I find it absurdly ironic that a man we trained to kill and sent to war is executed by the very government who trained him, while this past year the resident of the White House, Donald Trump, pardoned a soldier accused and charged with the killing of innocent children in one of our other wars. In fact, he even posed with the body of the child he killed. Unless a judge intervenes between today, as I record this sermon, or in the few hours after you hear this sermon, Daniel Lewis Lee will be the first legal murder at the Terre Haute Penitentiary since 2003. Glenda and I, along with others, will be there to protest this killing. Let me interject here some personal reflections on the death penalty. I have had some intimate conversations with a few of the residents of Indiana death row, two of whom were subsequently executed, and one whose sentence was commuted as I was driving to Michigan City to witness his execution. Arthur Baird. In 2005, I was called by one of Arthur's lawyers and asked if I would be willing to visit him in Michigan City. He was severely mentally ill and asked for a minister to witness his execution. I sat with Arthur for a couple of hours of rambling conversation. It was much like speaking to a very young child. It was clear to me that Arthur did not even understand the reality of death, the death of his parents and the wife whom he murdered. He believed that God would soon bring them back to life and he would see them again. As I drove to Michigan City a few weeks later, on the scheduled day of his murder, I was listening to the radio when the announcement was made that Mitch Daniels, then governor of Indiana, had commuted his sentence on the grounds that the majority of the jurors had testified that they would have voted for life without parole had it been an option at the time of Baird's trial. That was probably one of the very few actions by Governor Daniels with which I was in total agreement, and I was greatly relieved. Gary Burris was executed in 1997. He was abandoned as a newborn infant and thrown in a trash bin outside of whorehouse in Indy. He was found and raised by the prostitutes and began running drugs for them as a young boy. In 1980, he killed a cab driver in a botched robbery and was very remorseful for his crime. I had a conversation with Gary before his execution and wept when he died. Glenda and I were at Michigan City at a silent prayer vigil along with several dozen others at that execution. Across from us was a man and woman, probably in their 50s, who shouted obscenities at those of us standing in silent resistance to death. They continued to scream and holler at us, trying to drive us away. I decided to go speak with them. I was wearing a collar and looked quite clerical. I asked them why they were here, that we were simply praying for peace and objecting to legalized murder. And they told me that their daughter had been killed, had been murdered ruthlessly, and that the man who killed him had been executed and they witnessed his execution. And I said, did it help? No, it didn't help. Nothing helps. We go to executions, they said. We travel from state to state. We've attended more executions than you can count. We go every time there's an execution. I said, does it help? Do you feel any healing at all? No, it doesn't help. I tried to encourage them as I encourage you to look up the stories of folks who have found a different approach to healing from the murder of their loved ones. Murder victims' families for reconciliation. You can find them online. They have found that forgiveness and healing go hand in hand. Related to that conversation is a report I read yesterday of victims' families asking for the upcoming executions, 4 of them planned, to be postponed because they would not be able to witness them during this pandemic. I wish I could tell those persons that seeing the killer of their loved ones die will not ease their pain. In 1998, I had a 2-hour conversation with Robert Smith on a Friday night before his scheduled execution at midnight the following Sunday. I was asked by one of his appellate lawyers to try to talk him into agreeing to withdraw his plea bargain for the death penalty. Robert Smith had killed a fellow inmate who was convicted of killing a child. The Indiana DOC was concerned that executing a man who plea bargained for the death penalty would set a dangerous precedent that might lead to the killing of guards as a way of getting out of severe prison conditions. Robert had spent years in solitary confinement and chose death rather than return to such an existence. Robert Smith loved children and left all that he had saved during his incarceration and what he had before he was imprisoned. He dedicated it to children and gave it to homes for abused children. He studied Buddhism and practiced meditation. I spoke with him for a couple of hours, and I told him that if he chose to live, I would visit him every month for as long as I was able to do so, and that he would be able to continue to support the lives of the neglected children. He calmly said, "I will think about it. Thank you for calling." I said that I would welcome his call at any hour of the day or night, and I would look forward to talking to him again on the weekend. It was one of the longest weekends of my life. He never called, and he was murdered by the state at 1 minute after midnight on Monday morning. Lastly, let me share some words about Chad Fulks, who presently resides in the SCU, aka Death Row, at the Federal Penitentiary in Terre Haute. I've been Chad's spiritual advisor for more than 10 years. I'm not allowed to visit him at present. For one reason, the COVID pandemic has stopped visitations. But otherwise, I've been refused visitation rights for a mistake I made, which is embarrassing, but was not a crime, and was no threat to the security of the institution. It was just a mistake of negligence. And the ACLU has agreed to investigate that because I'm being blocked from visiting, primarily by the chaplain, I am told. We hope to get visitation rights back, and when it is possible, I will be visiting Chad again. Chad grew up in a dirt floor cabin, basically, in West Virginia. His house was one of violence and alcoholism. One of his neighbors testified that at a very early age he would sleep under the porch to hide from the violence in his house. He had read no books. He spent most of his juvenile years in detention, and then was on a killing spree of kidnapping and killing 2 women, one in West Virginia and one in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I met Chad when he wrote me and asked me to be a spiritual advisor and asked me to help him get over his fear of hell because he wanted to give up his appeals and be executed. Well, Chad got over his fear of hell, but more than that, in the last more than 10 years of visiting with him, he's learned to read. He's read many books. He's read Thich Nhat Hanh. He's learned to meditate, and he's become a human being. He is not the man who was involved in the crimes that he is convicted of. He is a changed human being. He trained mice, 2 mice, had them living with him in his cell for over 4 years. Even the guards would watch them do tricks. He even brought one out and showed it to me one day when we were visiting through the glass. He had it in his shirt and brought it out rather secretively and made it do a trick or ask it to, and it did. He loved those mice, Soldier Boy and Mama Girl, and they were his children. They helped him celebrate life. And then an overzealous unit manager, newly appointed, had an emergency search and stripping of the cells one day, and the main guard in the unit, the lead guard, told him, "We don't have surprise searches here. Everything is calm up here. We all get along, and we try to let the guys know if we want to search cells. We respect their privacy." But the unit manager said, "You have 15 minutes to empty the cells." And so all the prisoners were immediately taken out and put in cages. Chad pushed his mice into the shower, hoping they would not bother him. And a few minutes later, a young woman trainee guard who had been brought in just for the purpose of searching cells came to Chad and said, "We found your mice. You can't have them. It's against the rules." Chad said, "They're like my children. The warden knows, everybody knows I have them." He said, "Well, the unit manager says you can't have them, but I will try to find a petting zoo or something where children can enjoy them." A few minutes later, Chad saw the unit manager going by, and he called to him and said, "Please don't take my mice. They're like my children." And the unit manager told him Chad was literally crying, kneeling, begging for his children. The unit manager said, "What kind of man are you to cry for a couple of dumb mice? I can't give them back to you anyway. I just flushed them down the stool." Later that night, I got a call from a lawyer who said that Chad had been found hanging in his shower and had cut his wrist and attempted suicide. The federal penitentiary spent a lot of money to get him out of the cell, to rush him to Indianapolis and save his life, all for the purpose of killing him someday. Ironic, absurd, cruel. Chad is a human being. He's like a son to me. And if he is executed, I have promised to witness his execution, and he will be on the short list after these first 4, I suspect, if executions continue. Chad's IQ, by the way, at the time of trial was tested at 70. If it had been 69, it would be illegal to execute him. That's how arbitrary and capricious and absurd our death penalty policies are. By the way, Chad now has a beetle that he got from a bird, dropped it in his recreation cage when he was outside, and it had lost a couple of legs to the bird, so Chad took it inside. I can't remember what he named it, but that beetle comes out and sits on his finger and watches TV. Chad is a lover of life now. He's a changed man, and there is no reason for killing him except simple cruelty. In 1946, Albert Camus, in his essay, Neither Victims Nor Executioners, wrote, and I quote, "The question posed by the absurdity of our times is this: will you or will you not legitimize murder? For my part, I am fairly sure that I have made the choice, and having chosen, I think I must speak out. That I must state that I will never again be one of those, whoever they be, who compromise with murder, and that I must take the consequences of such a decision. To conclude, all I ask," he says, "in the midst of a murderous world, is we agree to reflect on murder and to make a choice. After that, we can distinguish those who accept the consequences of being murderers, themselves, or the accomplices to murder, and those who refuse to do so with all their force and being. Since this terrible dividing line does actually exist," Camus says, "it will be a gain if clearly marked. Over the expanse of 5 continents throughout the coming years, an endless struggle is going to be pursued between violence and friendly persuasion. A struggle in which, granted, the former has 1,000 times the chances of success than that of the latter. But I have always held that if he who bases his hopes on human nature is a fool, he who gives up in the face of the circumstances is a coward." End quote. So I have made that decision, not to compromise with murder, to speak out again and again. The Dalai Lama said, in order to carry a positive action, we must develop a positive vision. And he also said, our prime purpose in life is to help others, and if you can't help them, at least don't hurt them. Be kind, he says, whenever possible. Kindness is always possible. There is not a single instance of premeditated murder that is more premeditated, more calloused, more cold-blooded than to keep a man in a solitary cell for over a decade, many times 2 decades. And then on a particular date and a particular night, to open that door and lead him down a chamber and put him on a cross-shaped bed and inject him with poison. You cannot imagine a more cold-blooded murder. Back in Washington, D.C., back in the 90s, we met a woman from Atlanta, Georgia, who had 2 sons. One was killed in gang violence. The other was executed by the state of Georgia. She showed us the death certificates. Both of them read homicide. Murder is murder. I stand opposed to it in the streets, and I stand opposed to it in the prisons. I encourage you to speak out. If indeed the execution takes place tomorrow, I encourage you to be there. We will be there with all who will gather to say no to death. It is indeed what makes us human. Blessed be. So hello again, after you've heard my sermon and you've sang the closing hymn. I would like to give you closing words, but first an addendum to my sermon, a correction, if you will. In part of the sermon where I was off manuscript, I told you of my friend Chad Folks on death row. And I said that he was born in a dirt floor cabin. I meant to say he was born in a dirt poor family. Obviously, if he was in a dirt floor cabin, he probably wouldn't have had a porch to climb under. The point to be made was that poverty and violence is a dangerous mix, dangerous for children. Chad was a fetal alcohol syndrome infant with brain damage, and he has become a very amazing man, and we hope he lives to be an old man. As for the executions planned for tomorrow and the rest of the week, at this time, they are all stayed, and we won't know until the last minute if they hold. My guess is they will hold at least for a few days, and if not, when the execution takes place, we'll be in Terre Haute. So I say as closing words to you, hold all of those in the penitentiaries around the world in your heart. Hold all of those who find these times difficult to live in your heart. And try to learn, as I continually try to learn, to love our enemies and find a way to change the world. Go out, speak out, and walk in peace. Blessed be.